Malo. I am an MSc in mathematics student at the University of Eswatini, which is southern part of Africa. I'm not sure if you know that. So the purpose of this session is to learn more on recommendation letters. So basically, you'll be learning on the role of these letters in grad school, and also how you identify your potential writers for your letters, and also how you approach them so that you make sure that you get the information you need from them in time. So may I at this time warmly welcome all of us to this session. Also, maybe it's worth noting that the session is recorded and live streamed. Secondly, there's going to be a poll that's going to be popping up right now. So may you please respond to the question. So basically, you're going to be indicating your agreement with the statement that says, I have nearly finished selecting my letter writers. So you just select the response which best suits your condition right now. So I'm just going to give you a moment to go through that before I introduce our amazing speaker for the session. All right. Looks like we have responses already. So about 25% of you agree that they already have selected. Well, some of you haven't decided on that, which is not a problem at all, because the session is going to help you figure that out. So I'm hoping that by the end of the session, you'll be able to think of the people you want to approach to your recommendation letters. Sorry. So our speaker for the session is going to be Osase Omari. I hope I said that right. A second-year PhD student in astronomy and history of science at Harvard University. Her research interests lie in star formation, stellar feedback, galaxy formation, and evolution. Osase, thank you very much for agreeing to do this, and welcome to the session.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let me start sharing my screen.
So anytime you're ready, I think you can go ahead.
Okay. Okay, so can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see your screen.
Awesome, sounds good. Okay, so thank you again for the introduction. So as she said, my name's Osase, and today we have about 50 minutes to think about securing recommendation letters for graduate school. Okay, so I think I skipped this. Yes. So in this presentation, I really want you all to understand why recommendation letters are important and how you can build a strong relationship with your potential writer and how you can help them represent you effectively. So I structured this talk. So we'll spend 35 minutes going through slides and exercises. You're going to want something to write or type on for these exercises. And we're also going to have about 15 minutes for a Q&A. So let's start with why letters are important. So if you are or were a college student, you probably very familiar with the concept of letter recommendation because you needed them to apply to college and to get any internships or fellowships that you applied for in college as well. So for the grad school admissions process, however, recommendation letters are pretty different. Letters are used to do three things. They're used to rank you compared to your peers. So your reference writers will have to fill out checkboxes comparing you to your peers and pass students on a number of measures, which may include, your research capabilities, your personal characteristics, your potential to succeed in your field of choice, and even your English language abilities. And these ratings will take the form of like marking off a checkbox, such as the best student in my 10 years of teaching, top 5% in my 10 years of teaching, the top 1% this year, top 5% this year, etc. Another way that letter recommendations are used is to give applicants who are weak in certain areas a second chance. For example, if your GPA and test scores are not stellar, a glowing recommendation letter from a prominent professor or researcher can really sway the admissions committee. And lastly, letters of recommendation can be used to account for extraneous situations. So if there's not enough space in your personal statement to explain anomalies in your transcript, for example, there's a death in your family and that semester's grades are a lot different from any other semesters, the letter is a chance for that to be addressed. So what kind of rec letters do you need? Grad schools are primarily looking for three things in a letter of recommendation. They want to see that you've done or that you're capable of being able to conduct a research project. This means if you've done research or had practical experience, you want recommendation letters from those advisors. The more research letters you have, the better, since grad school is primarily about doing research. In a research letter, they want to know about your knowledge of the field, skills, your creativity, originality, intelligence, work ethic, independence, etc. They also want letters that highlight your academic skills. So you want a letter that can speak to your academic accomplishments, your potential, and thorough understanding of material. And lastly, you want a letter that highlights your really great qualities as a person and potential as a great scientist. So they're looking for qualities like integrity, maturity, interpersonal skills, leadership ability, your communication skills, teamwork, and just the ability to work with a diverse group of people. So, I think, yes. So how many letters of recommendation do you want? Most programs will require at least 3 letters of recommendation, and they'll allow you to submit up to 5 if you believe the extra letters will help you describe you as an applicant better. All in all, you want as many research letters as possible, 1 academic focused letter from a professor, or 1 academic and personality focused letter. It's best to ask someone with whom you've done research. So this could be a professor at a university or a supervisor in industry, or if you've taken a long time off after college before going back to grad school, supervisors at your most recent job will be good no matter the type of work. So these people, so what if your research mentor was a postdoc or a graduate student? Is it okay to ask them for a letter? So letters from faculty members or the equivalent, like a senior staff at a national lab, will usually carry more weight in an application. However, if the person you've worked with is primarily a more junior person, one thing you can do is ask the professor to write you a letter of recommendation using the draft letter written by the junior person that you worked with. So the next best is going to be a classroom professor. So the best classroom professors to write you a strong letter are those you've gotten to know really well, whether by taking a small seminar course, by visiting their office hours and talking with them sometimes. Sometimes a letter from a professor who knows you well will turn out a lot better than from someone whose class you got perfect grades in, but never got to know. So if you don't know anyone well, you don't need to be the professor's best friend, but you can get friendly by having conversations with people you think are cool and do cool work every once in a while and asking for advice. So the next best will be your academic advisor. An academic advisor may not be able to comment on how you did in the classroom or a lab, but in some cases, it can be very good to get a rec letter from an advisor if you've had an unusual educational track or a disruption to your studies. Also, if they did actually teach you in a class or you did research with them, that could make for a very strong letter since they've known you for at least 3 years. You should be super cautious about asking for a rec letter from an advisor of one of your non-field related extracurricular activities. However, if there are fellowships that value these kinds of letters for recommendations, like the Fulbright, for example. And lastly, you should never, ever ask a family member, your significant other, or a friend to write you a recommendation letter. So whoever you choose, the people you ask for a letter should know you well enough. And ideally, at least one of your references should be from the field in which you want to go to grad school in. But it's still perfectly fine to have references from different but generally related STEM fields. So after hearing all of this, let's take 2 minutes to do an exercise. I want students who are applying this cycle to write down who do you think your 3 main letter writers will be, and who do you want your backup letter writer to be. I also want students applying future cycles to think who may be your 3 main letter writers, and if you don't know all of them, what kind of letter do you need? Like, will it be academic, research, personal? So take 2 minutes, and if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll answer them. So I see the question asking, is it okay to ask a professor who is not in your intended subfield? So if they're in a related field, but just any STEM field, that is completely fine if you don't have anyone else, but you did research with them. That will still be a strong letter. You don't have to post it in the chat, but you can. That's completely fine. That'd be cool too.
So we do have a question asking, do schools expect you to submit as many writers as possible? And if you have more than 3 people, would it be reasonable to ask, is there a point where it's just too much?
Yeah. So if you have like people basically saying the same thing, you don't really want to submit all of them because that's just more work for the committee. So submit your 3 strongest letters, and you can have a 4th or a 5th, just as a backup. But also, if you think they can really speak to all of your strengths, submit all 5. Like if they're saying completely different things in all 5, submit all 5. That's completely fine. But usually you have like 3 main people who you like extensively worked with that you really want to write you a letter. Okay, I'll give you all 30 more seconds and then we can move on. Okay, so how worried should you be about the ranking? Like, I think I've done good work, but top 5% of their career, do not be worried about this because this is out of your hands. Just make sure you've done your best and your professor will do the rest. Okay, so now let's move on. So now that we've talked about who we want our references to be, let's think of how we can build stronger relationships with these people. For this, I have 3 guidelines. Number 1 is to simply spend time with them. If there's a professor you can see writing a letter for you, attend their office hours. Bring some thoughtful questions as well. If you work with a postdoc or in a group, attend group meetings regularly and participate. If you no longer work with the person or group, try to keep in touch by giving the writer updates on the projects you worked with them on. For example, if you worked with someone over the summer and you're going to present that research at a conference, let them know, especially if you made a poster. That would be really good. Number 2 is do not overthink it. Professors write letters of recommendation all the time. If you've worked with them, they know you may want a letter at some point. So you don't need to try and become super close with them if you're not comfortable doing so. And lastly, you should try to join in one of their projects or extracurriculars. Like if you don't have much of a relationship with this person at all, then try getting involved in one of their projects or activities, and that way you can get to know them a bit better. Okay, so now we're going to do another exercise. I want students applying this cycle to think about which letter writers do you have the strongest relationship with. And based on the tips that I just gave you, what can you do now to improve your relations with those who aren't as strong? And for students applying in future cycles, how can you build stronger relations with those you have in mind now and between now and your application cycle? And what projects or activities can you think of that will help you meet a potential letter writer? Again, take 2 minutes. And if you have any questions or want to brainstorm ideas, please post in the Q&A or the chat, and let's talk about it. Okay, so I see a question. Is it, Scott?
You can still comment. It was wondering if it's okay to ask the same professor to write multiple letters of recommendations.
Yes, for several schools. I think you've had the apply to grad school workshop. You should apply to several schools, not just one. You can ask them to apply to several. It's good. Okay, if there's no more questions, we'll take 1 more minute to think about how you can improve your relationship with these people that you plan on asking or you've already asked. is there a max amount that you should be aware of? A max amount of recommendation letters to ask for? So it really depends on the school. Most schools will request that you submit at least 3 letters of recommendation. The sweet spot may be 4. I say 4 just in case, one of your professors has an issue and they're not able to get it in on time. So if they're not able to get it in on time, at least you should have the recommended 3. But I'd say 3 to 4 is a good amount. And you can add a 5th one if you really think that 5th person is gonna add something really important to your application. So if you had 5 research letters, get all those 5 research letters. But if your 5th letter is like someone who doesn't know you as well, you don't need to include that 5th letter. Okay, so the exercise is over. Now that we have a plan of action for how we're going to build strong relations with our letter writers, how can we get them to represent us in the best way? So a piece of this is in how you ask. You can ask in person or over video chat, but you still must send an email so that both you and your writer have record of it. So here's an example email template. In all cases, you must send an email, reminding the person how they know you, why you feel their letter will be useful in speaking to a certain aspect of your application. And then you want to ask the professor if they could write you a strong, emphasis on strong letter of recommendation, and include the earliest deadline for all the graduate programs that you're applying to. Lastly, you want to make sure you give them the chance to say no in your email. So let's discuss responses. If they say no, accept that answer. Generally, professors will only write good letters, and the refusal to write means that their letter will only hurt you, not help you. So, sometimes they may cushion it by telling you they're too busy to write. Do not push them. Accept the no. So if you get a hesitant yes, and this person is not your only option, decline their offer. They'll probably give you a way to get out of requiring them to write you a letter. And if they are your only option, you will need to give them a very detailed summary sheet, which we're going to discuss in the next few slides. So what you want is an enthusiastic response where they're going to agree to writing you a very strong letter of recommendation. Some people are less enthusiastic than others just based on their personality. So you want to gauge their response based on how you know the person is. And if you don't know how that person is, we'll talk about this later on. All right, so they've said yes. What materials do you need to give them to help them make your letter strong? So here's an example of a follow-up email. You want to give them a detailed list of programs and deadlines in the form of a list or an Excel table. I'll show you an example of it in the next few slides. You also want to give them your CV, a page describing your relationship with them, which experiences with them you feel speak best of you, and which aspect of your CV and personal characteristics that they can really highlight. Feel free to use lots of headings and bold font and italics to make it easy for them to find the relevant facts about you. You also want to send a draft of your graduate statements as soon as possible, if possible. And if you decide to add more programs or remove a program, let them know as quickly as possible. So I talked about responses right now. This is an example of a professor replying with a very hesitant yes. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but here, they say, I hesitate to say yes explicitly because they only had a seminar with the person. And so here they're saying, I really can't write you a strong letter, but I'm still willing to write you one if you really need it. If you are in this boat, what you can do is acknowledge that they feel concerned, but also give them a lot of strong documents that will help them write your letter. So what you can do is give them a resume, telling them, provide like a link to something that shows what they need, what a letter for the graduate school that you're applying to, a good letter will look like for the graduate school that you're applying to, a short description of your experience in their seminar or doing research with them, and a draft of your personal statement. So this short description is probably the most important one because they're probably not sure what to talk about in the letter they write about you. If you can write a very detailed summary sheet for them, that will give them more than enough of what they need to write you a stronger letter than it could have been based on their limited experience with you. So you also want to send them a table or list that looks like this. So you want to have the due date, the name and location of the program, a website for the program, what you're interested in doing in the program, so your research interests, and how to submit the letter. This is super important because many grad schools, I don't think they've standardized how letters of recommendation are submitted yet, but for some schools, you need to give your person an address that they should mail their letter to, and there may be some accompanying forms. Sometimes you may need to pick up a letter in a signed and sealed envelope from your professor and then mail it to the school. But most schools, I believe now, they have a website where the professor could upload the recommendation themselves. So if that's the case, you just want to give your professor the link to make sure that they can submit. Okay, so here is an example of a summary sheet. So in this summary sheet, they talk about their experience in the class. And even though this is an academic letter, you can still relate this to your research interests and what you plan to do in graduate school. So this class may have been super developmental for you in what you want to pursue in graduate school. So you can talk about what they did in that class that really resonated with you and your research interests. You should also talk about what you did to overcome any challenges that you experienced in that class. So, a lot of times the person you ask for a letter may not be the person you got the highest grade with, but that class did challenge you, really motivated you, and helped to shape your trajectory in terms of why you're applying to graduate school right now. So use this summary sheet to really drive home why you're a strong candidate and why this person can really speak to your experience here. Okay, so when is the best time to do all that I've mentioned and to give yourself the best odds of having your letter submitted on time? So before your application year, you want to develop relationships with researchers and faculty members in your field through research, classwork, and internships. You want to keep your advisors updated on what you're doing when you can. For example, if you present a research poster for work you've done together, if you meet a teacher in an office hours to discuss life and work, asking questions about their research career, etc. And in July of your application year, you want to research and create an initial list of fellowships in grad school that you want to apply to. From August to mid-October, you want to send out emails to 3 professors that you want most to write your recommendation letter and ask if they would write one for you and explicitly state when the first deadline is. So you want to tell them you'll follow up with them closer to the deadline when you have your preliminary materials ready. So this means your statement of purpose, your CV, everything else. And I say mid-October because the earliest grad apps are usually due December 1st for fall 2021, but this can vary. So try to have a document keeping track of all of this. I will show you what this may look like later on in the presentation. So at least 3 weeks before the first deadline for your letters, you want to input your recommenders into the program's online system. So you do not need to have a complete application to do this. The system will notify them automatically. Or if they don't have a system, you need to be aware of that. So you need to get their address to be mailed and all of that. You also want to follow up and send an email with materials for their letter, ensuring that they receive the submission information and that it didn't go to spam if they're going to be submitting online. So 1 week before the deadline, you also want to check to see if they're on track to submit on time. If they need extra time, this is important. Tell them to reach out to the program through call or email. I listed an email template down here for what it looks like in following up, just in case you're not sure. But this is just it's just a pretty simple, basic email. You don't have to do too much. But yeah, the day after the deadline. So if they haven't sent it, you want to check in and ask why, and ask if they can call or email the program this reason that they have. So grad programs are usually lenient with letters because they're not in your control if an emergency happens on the recommender side. So for programs with rigid deadlines, this is why I recommend submitting more than the minimum. So I have at least 4 or 5 people maybe, just to make sure that if someone falls through, you're always going to have at least 3 strong ones there to support you. So lastly, after you're accepted, which you all will be, you want to send a thank you email and inform them of your success. Okay, So now that we have all this information, let's do one more exercise. I want students applying this cycle to ask yourselves if you've sent your writers all of the materials mentioned for a strong letter. I think that's in slide 21. You should have access to these slides beforehand, I think, or if not, you can ask again in the chat. But are you on a good timeline? Have you created your spreadsheets and double check deadlines? And set your reminders in Google Calendar or your preferred calendar right now in these 3 minutes. I also want those applying in the future to think about which of the materials that I mentioned that you can begin putting together now. Because remember, your letters, they're not just going to be good for graduate school, but for applying to any other research programs or fellowships that you may be interested in as well. So take 2 to 3 minutes to do this, and then we'll wrap up. And you can also ask any questions that you may have in the Q&A or in the chat.
So I say we do have a question in the Q&A, and it says it's kind of an awkward question, but if you only receive hesitant yeses from the groups of people you recommend getting letters from, what do you recommend that the student do?
Okay, so everybody you want a letter from is hesitant. That's not a good sign. But you can do the tips that I mentioned before, making sure you send all of them a very strong and detailed summary sheet, even more detailed than what I put in there, because you asked them for a reason. You think that they can speak to this about you. And so if you can list exactly what they should speak to you about, then that gives them all that they need. And I think in a lot of these cases, that person who you think is hesitant probably hasn't worked with you in depth. So maybe there was a TA in that class. Maybe ask the TA to write you a letter, or at least write the skeleton of the letter, and then have the professor sign on to it and add to it based on the summary sheet that you gave both the professor and the TA. Okay, so I'll give you about 1 to 2 more minutes. And remember, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Oh, my bad.
I have a question. What do you do if your timeline is not, maybe you find out late about a fellowship, but you still really need a letter and you still would really like to apply? How do you approach the professors if you need like a last minute letter recommendation?
Yes. So I provided a very ideal timeline because this is the best way that you can get someone to not say no to you. But if you are applying very last minute, if you haven't asked this person for a letter before, they probably will say no. And you may just have to be okay with that and find somewhere else, unfortunately. But if this is someone you've asked for a letter before, then you probably can ask, because then they'll just have to tweak a few things and then they'll be able to submit it for you. But in that email that you send to them, say that you apologize, that you know this is really late and you should have given them more notice. I've done this several times. It's fine. Tell them that you should have given them more time, but this is really important to you. And if they can submit it, you'll really appreciate it. And a lot of times they will, if they have the time, but sometimes they're like out of the country, they're not responding to email. So you may just be out of luck. So try to give them at least 2 to 3 weeks in advance if you can.
Thank you. Yeah, I got you.
Yeah.
There's questions coming in now. So how long is it acceptable to wait to email for a follow-up on Zoom meetings or letters of recommendations?
How long is it acceptable to wait? It depends on your deadline. Like if you have worked with this professor before and they're pretty forgetful, maybe try to remind them a month in advance. And then, if they haven't replied to you, send another email like a week or 2 later, just to make sure you remind them about 2 to 3 weeks before your deadline, because this is your application, not necessarily theirs. And, sometimes professors and big people are busy. So it's really in your court to make sure that they know that this deadline is coming and that they have to meet it for you. Is it okay to send a little present after someone gives you the letter? Yes. Yes. After I ask for my letters, I usually send like a little card or something, and they usually appreciate it. Or you can give whatever kind of gift that that you have in mind. A little present is good. You don't have to like go all out for this professor. This is their job, so you're good. Okay, so I think you all should be wrapped up now. So let's move forward. Or no, there's another question. Is it okay to ask for a letter from my supervisor I work on my job with, although it's not relevant to your major? Have you been out of school for a while? If you've been out of school for a while, I would say yes, because you chose to work this job and they want to know what you were doing. And yeah, but if you are in school and this is a job that's not related to your major, maybe not. But maybe because this could be a personal letter if they know you really well like that, and they could speak to other qualities like your maturity, or your integrity, your ability to work in a team. So it really depends on what you think they could speak to this person. Okay. So sorry, I went too far. Okay, so we have a plan, but let's discuss potential complications when we're soliciting letters of recommendation. Unfortunately, as women of color, we are very likely to have at least one toxic relationship with an advisor due to STEM's racist culture. And this can really harm you in the admissions process because if you fail to send a letter from a research experience, the committee will probably assume that your research experience went poorly, which is not fair. So if you're in a scenario where you've had an abusive or toxic mentor, here are some potential options. So if you have several other good research experiences, choose from those instead of the bad one. If the bad one is super significant and is your thesis, for example, look to see if you can get a co-advisor on the work and have them write you a letter instead. And though awful, mentors do need you to be successful for their own reputation. If you've had a negative experience with this person, but they still agree to write you a letter, try applying to a different program with their recommendation only and ask the program for feedback on your application and specifically on the recommendation letter. They may still write you a strong one. I have personal experience with this. I thought my experience with this person went poorly, but because me succeeding looked good for them, I applied to a research program with them as my only letter and asked for feedback. And it turns out that they wrote me a really strong letter. However, this is not always the case. Sometimes they will tank your letter, especially if someone else that is in their group is also applying with you. So do try to be careful about this. Is a very tricky situation. But these are some things that I found out for how to navigate it. And if you have an advisor that you can't really read, so they said yes, but they don't seem super enthusiastic. They didn't exactly say the word strong. They just said yeah, sure, or okay, send from my iPhone, like many professors do. They didn't really give you an out either. So what you want to do is you want to speak to a professor or a student that knows this advisor well, and you want to ask if the response they gave you is normal. If not, consider another advisor and use this person's letter as a backup. Again, mentors need you to be successful for their own reputation. So if you're not sure, again, you can try applying to a different program with their recommendation only and ask the program for feedback on your application. They may still have written you a strong one. So if you're in a different situation and none of these solutions above can work for you, feel free to post in the chat or in the Q&A box. And then we can all try brainstorming solutions to help you out. Or you can just email me separately afterwards and we can talk. Okay, so I also want to emphasize that even if you follow all of these steps that I mentioned in this presentation, I would say about 35% of how much your letters help or hurt you depend on following these steps. But the 65% largely comes from people who you could have excellent letters, but if someone has good letters from Ivy professors or people in the program's colleagues, that person will likely have an edge over you, and it's not your fault. I say this not to discourage you, but to recognize none of this process is fair, and it's not your fault either. A lot of people like to say it's just luck, but that luck has a lot to do with structural biases. And so you shouldn't beat yourselves up at all. I really encourage you all to work together rather than see each other as competitors, because a lot of this is out of your hands, but you can still support each other. And hopefully we can change this culture together. So I know I've given you a lot of information. So to help you keep track and to minimize getting overwhelmed during this very, very overwhelming process, my first tip is to make a spreadsheet and keep a template like what I have here. You want to make a spreadsheet to keep track of your letters and also have a document that has all of your letter writer information, because usually the applications request that you manually put their information in over and over and over again. What you also want to do is set reminders with your favorite reminder app or calendar and send recommendation submission requests in batches if it's too overwhelming to do at once. Like for example here, at least 3 weeks before December 15th, you send the request to programs due by that date and so on. So if you have some in January or by the 31st, you can do it all in batches instead of all at once. Okay. And last but not least, you want to have first drafts of things ready to send. So they do not have to be perfect. You want to send the draft as long as it's complete with your ideas. It can be in bullet points rather than paragraphs if you haven't had the time to make it pretty yet. Don't focus on perfecting each step. Just give your recommender enough. And remember that you can always follow up with a polished version if they still need more information. So thank you all for listening, and let's move on to the Q&A.
Sure, we have some questions filtering in through the Q&A. So they ask, should we have one letter from each category or only research/major specific, etc.?
So what you want is you want mostly research letters. So if you've had 3 research experiences, you want 3 research letters. But if you haven't had 3 research experiences, what you can do is have maybe 2 research letters and an academic/personal letter, or you can have 1 research letter, a strong academic letter, and the second strong academic and personal letter. So you always want more research, but if you can't always get that much more, try to mix and match from the other 2. And it's not always a strict research only letter. They can also talk about your academics and personal in these research letters. Okay.
All right. The next question says, so if they don't sound enthusiastic, is it best not to ask them, or to back up out of fear of being impolite or unappreciative? Should you have a backup letter to make up for it?
So if they don't sound enthusiastic, so usually if you don't sound enthusiastic, like the letter I showed, they will give you an out and say, I'm not sure I could write you the strongest letter. If they give you an out and you have somebody else, take the out and say, I completely understand, thank you again, goodbye. That's all. Then ask your next person. But if you need this hesitant person, then follow the steps that I gave. But if you're not going to come across as being like impolite or unappreciative, these professors, these people know they've done letters before. They probably have, so don't internalize it too much. You asking them and saying that you don't want it anymore, that is completely fine. Just be polite and respectful when you do it, and you should be fine.
Thank you so much. So our next question says, what are some non-graduate school opportunities you can apply for to see if your mentor will send in a strong letter?
So one of these things is if you're in school, there's usually a ton of like internal school awards that you may be able to apply for, or programs or something like that. And I recommend applying to one of those smaller scale programs. So that way you can probably go up to the person who read your letter, your application, and ask like, hey, do you have any feedback on this application? But if you don't have many opportunities through your school, there are other smaller research opportunities that you can apply for online. I'm not sure what your field is, so I can't give you specifics, but they probably do have them if you look into it, and like scholarships and fellowships and all of this stuff. So there are programs that you can find to apply for.
Thank you. And then our next question says, oh, just curious, who did you ask to write your letters of recommendation?
Yeah. So I did 3 research programs, and so I had all 3 of my research program advisors write me a letter. And then I also had a teacher that I was really close with in one of my classes, but I wasn't really close with them, but I did very well in their class. And I also went to their office hours a lot and learned a lot from them. And I asked them for a recommendation letter for graduate school. But before I met this academic person, there was someone else in my research program who wasn't my research advisor, but who was kind of a sort of a mentor to me. And so I would ask her for a letter as well, just to speak to the personal and academic aspects. And before I had this person, when I didn't know anybody, I would ask my teacher in the first class that I took on campus, but I had to give him a very strong summary sheet because he didn't know me that well. I never went to office hours. But yeah, so there are ways you can finesse it using the tips that I gave you.
Thank you for that. And thank you for sharing your own personal experience. That is like super awesome that you were able to do that for us. Another question that has come in says, I've been told you should ask for a letter of recommendation when you are fresh in that person's mind. But what if you are not applying to grad school for the current cycle?
When you're fresh in that person's mind, I don't know, because if you ask them when you're fresh, but you're not applying for anything, they'll probably forget about it. But if what you mean is that at the end of a program, you're going to tell them, hey, I'd be interested in getting a letter from you and asking, and they'll probably say like, if they're okay with doing that or not, that would be a good idea if you want to do that. But if you don't feel comfortable, because some people don't feel comfortable talking to professors directly like that, that's completely fine. Just make sure in the email that you send them several weeks in advance, you remind them who you are, you know, how they know you, and why you think they would be a good person to write you this letter of recommendation.
That's awesome advice. And another question we have is, do you consider there's a time limit between working with someone and asking them for a letter? So 3 to 4 years or so. And I can actually chime in on this as well when you're done with your answer.
Oh yeah. So for me, I think it really depends. Like 3 to 4 years. I know for me, when I was applying to grad school, if I asked anyone 4 years ago to give me a letter, it wasn't going to be related to what I wanted to do. So I just would not ask them because it's not related at all. So it depends. Like if this is someone who you did in an area that is close to what you want to do in grad school, sure, and you don't have anyone that's more recent, then yes, you can ask them for a letter. But it's always better to have someone who's worked with you more recently and who has an idea of who you are currently. Or if you've been keeping in touch with this person over the 3 to 4 years, that would be fantastic because they can speak to you and how you've grown over the years as well.
Agreed. And this is definitely I'm a more non-traditional student. So I'm just starting my first year of my PhD program. And 2 of the letters that I asked for actually came from people who are my teachers like 10 years ago. So, but I had kept in contact with them and I knew that they remembered me. So that helped me a lot. And to be clear, I sent them like a huge sheet of accomplishments and things that I had done since the last time we spoke, because I knew that it had been 10 years since they looked at me. So they might need to know what I was doing. So if you're confident that this person does remember you and that they would be able to provide a positive, glowing recommendation, then by all means, reach as far back as you're going to need to, because we do understand that there are non-traditional routes to grad school. Some people, it's not a linear path, and some people do not go straight through. So the questions are still open for anybody who would like to ask a few more questions in these last few minutes that we do have left in this session.
But if you have questions and you can't think of them now, again, my email is here. Feel free to message me. If I can't help you, I'll find someone on the stage here with us to help you as well, or someone else, you know, you will be helped.
Thank you so much. And as we wait for these questions to roll in, I do want to say thank you, Osase, for joining us today and bringing this beautiful presentation. And I did not know that I could follow up with the professor and say, you didn't submit my letter. May I please ask where it might be or what happened? I did not know that that was an option if they'd missed the deadline. So thank you so much, because I learned something, and I'm already in grad school, but in case something else happens and there's other awards I want to apply to, I now know that I can say, hey, would you be willing to let the committee know that this is why the letter did not get written, and see if there's any way that we can move forward. We did just have a question enter, and it says, can a postdoc researcher provide a letter of recommendation for a student?
So usually you're never just working with a postdoc, or maybe you are. If you are only working with this postdoc, then yes, they can write you a letter of recommendation. These are qualified people, that's completely fine. But usually you're working with a postdoc in a group with a professor as the head. So what you can do is ask the postdoc to write you the letter, and then have the professor also sign off on that letter and submit it on your behalf, and also contribute to it a little bit. But if that's not available for you, get an interest from the postdoc, that's completely fine.
Okay, in the interest of time, unfortunately, we come to the end of the session. Thank you very much, Basasa, for taking your time to prepare this wonderful presentation. And thank you very much, Jackson. Thank you very much to the participants for rolling in such amazing questions. So as we head out, please make sure that after the 10 minutes break, you come back at exactly 3:45 ET for the check-in for announcements. Please make sure that you keep time. Thank you. See you in the next session.
Thank you, Fasila. Thank you, everybody. We'll see you at 3:45 for the check-in. Midday check-in, be there.